Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mr. Fabian. I am an advisor on security and trade here at SME Europe. Welcome to another SME Europe discussion. Today we are in the European Parliament in the VoxBox discussing about the Mena region and how we can navigate between the intricate policy mix of security, human rights and economics affairs. I have here a distinguished panel along my side. So first of all, our gracious host, Mr. Ivan Štefanec, member of the European Parliament, member of IMCO, ITRE, AIDA committee, and most importantly, president of SME Europe of the EPP. We have in the debate Mr. Daniel Schwamenthal, who is director of the AJC Transatlantic Institute, which is the Brussels-based office of the American Jewish Committee, an advocacy group on Jewish affairs here in Brussels. Thank you, sir, for being here. We have with us Dr. Helmut Pisecki, who is the CEO of Mar Adentro and former security analyst with the Austrian Ministry of Defense and consultant on foreign affairs and security policy. Thank you also for being here, sir. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Saida Keller-Mesali, who is a human rights activist with a lot of experience on the Mena region and beyond. So, as a way to frame the discussion, because this is always nice to do initially, we find ourselves in the global context of great power competition. And a lot of people talk about the US and China, certainly lately about the European Union and Russia, but we should not forget about the other very important areas of the world and our interactions with these areas. We are pushing a very proactive agenda forward, but we sometimes find this intricate mix between, again, security, human rights, economic affairs, development policy, to bring sometimes more challenges than solutions. So I'm very happy to discuss today with our panel how we can navigate through these uncharted waters. First of all, nonetheless, I would like to give the floor to our gracious host, Mr. Štefanec, for an introduction. Please, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tudor. Really nice to be with you today and with our special guests related to this topic, because it's very important. As you outlined, I think this is absolutely true that we are now living in challenging times. So after pandemic, major influence is criminal Russian invasion to Ukraine and followed energy crisis. And learning is that we have to keep our principles. We have to stay strong on our principles, but also we have to look for economic recovery and we have to look for new partners. And from this perspective, MENA region is quite important, was always important, but if we have a look to the figures, so in terms of economical development, it was decline of trade in the last couple of years, particularly due to pandemic. We have some challenges because of security, as we know that from this region many conflicts were risen, and I'm sure we will touch these issues as well. We will talk about human rights, how to tackle this issue, because very often we talk about human rights from a perspective of big businesses, but if we talk about SMEs from position of SMEs Europe, let me highlight the issue that this is important also for small companies, but this topic, which is also discussed in the European Parliament, should be addressed not in the way of bureaucracy, rather to how to tackle the issues, how to address it, but not with negative impact to SMEs, which is very important, that we will not lose our competitiveness in Europe. This is the same from human perspective, from environmental perspective. Those are the challenges ahead of us, but we have to be very careful about it. Last but not least, let me mention a special country in this region, which is Iran, which makes us very cautious right now, also taking into consideration Russian invasion, and Iran is supporting openly. We know that this is one of the countries in the region which is supplying weapons, and in Iran there is, from human rights perspective, special situation, particularly now in the last couple of days. So we have to be very cautious. We have to pay special attention to this country, and also in the European Parliament, I have to say, this is on daily basis information, and we are in touch also with opposition, which is basically based outside Iran. And this country, I think, is really something what needs to be under our radar more because of security issue, not only in this region, but because of security in Europe. Now, in times when we lost the peace in Europe, this is now also due to the support from this region, from Iran. So we should be aware of this, and if we talk about security, just to include it. So that is at the beginning. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Stefanets, thank you very much. This was very useful in presenting sort of the very complex picture that we're in. We have to stay true to our principles, but at the same time, we have to find out new ways to diversify, look at competitiveness, consider small and medium-sized enterprises that are, at the end of the day, the backbone of the European economy. And indeed, we have to look at the intricacies of red tape and bureaucracy. Of course, the issue of Iran will be touched upon today as well, not least because of the links to the war in Ukraine, and for instance, the provision of Iranian drones, so on and so forth. But I'm happy now to turn to Mr. Schwamenthal, discussing the broader region. We in Europe rather often say that there is a nexus between security and development. Maybe it's a chicken and egg situation, but indeed it's difficult to have development without security. Could you maybe spare a couple of words about the security situation in the broader area, of course with a keen eye on Israel, but how the security situation has been developing and how this impacts business at the end of the day? It's very helpful.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I couldn't agree more with what you just said. There's always this tension in foreign policy between what is morally right to do and what may be in our economic and security interest. But if we have a really sober analysis of the difficulties we find ourselves in the great power competition, in our competition with Russia and with Iran, I think the problem was not that we simply went for economic and security interests, but that we simply ignored all three elements. We ignored morality, but we actually also did ignore our true economic and security interests. It never made sense that we relied so much on Russian energy supplies, and also particularly in a way that would, through Nord Stream 2, would have allowed Russia to blackmail Poland and Ukraine. It never made any security, and as we now see, it never made any economic interest, as we will now all experience this winter. The same is true for China. You know, we went in there for the short-term profit, allowing Chinese companies to steal our intellectual property rights. We have become completely dependent on very basic supplies. Again, I don't think we really properly understood what are our national security and ultimately also our economic interests. So very often we actually went against all of these three elements. And I think the same has also happened in the Middle East, where we have been engaging Iran for basically from the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, in the hope to make economic profits, which were never high in the region, and we completely ignored the threat that Iran poses, not just as an aspiring nuclear power, but also there is not a single conflict in the region that doesn't have Iranian fingerprints on it. From Yemen to Iraq to the war in Syria, where Iran has been a partner, a war crime partner with Russia, where we watched for 10 years, 500,000 people were murdered. And much of the refugee crisis that we experienced was ultimately the result of Iranian and Russian policy. And now we are experiencing it on our border. Ukrainians have to pay the price that we were so short-sighted. And Israel, of course, is also a potential and actual target of Iranian aggression. We have Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy in the north, in Lebanon, with 150,000 missiles. We have the Houthis in Yemen, that have carried out a number of very sophisticated attacks against UAE using Iranian drones, Iranian missiles, Iranian know-how and operation. We have Shiite groups, proxies in Iraq, again, supplied by Iran, of course, in Syria. So there is a great danger of a future war between Israel, Iran, and all these proxies that would lead to a devastating war in the region. At the same time, with all that gloom that I just described, there is a wonderful story happening with the Abraham Accords. And I think here are opportunities where Israel has now entered into peace treaties, into normalization with a number of important Arab countries that are really can transform the region economically, but primarily also socially, politically. And it's very important. The name Abraham Accords was really, I don't know who exactly came up with it, but it's a stroke of genius, because it underlines that this is not just about economics, politics, high tech, and all that, which is all important, but this is about bringing people and religions together. The Abraham, the forefather of Judaism, of Christianity, and Islam. This is a powerful message for the entire region against radicalization, which we should wholeheartedly embrace. Unfortunately, I think Europe was, in the beginning, even some in Europe were hostile to it and have been very, very slow in embracing it. I think economically Europe is losing out. There are huge opportunities there also for European companies, but also in terms of really helping to stabilize the region, which should be in our security interest. But also I think there are, and I'm eager to hear also more from you, I think there are opportunities here in our fight against radicalization. If we can showcase that Morocco and United Arab Emirates are not just making peace, they are traveling to Israel. You go to Tel Aviv airport, and now you see on the screen flights to Dubai, Manama, Abu Dhabi, Marrakesh. It's a whole new world, and I think this is a story that we should use here with our Muslim communities in Europe to tell this story. And I think it could be a very potent weapon against radicalization.
Right. Thank you very much for those constructive comments. Indeed, you rightly highlight the importance of morality in foreign policy and the importance of having long-term strategies in dealing historical or long-term challenges. I think whatever you're discussing the dangers of division, you can also discuss about the potential of cohesion. So in this sense, thank you for mentioning the Abraham Accords, which is an important step in building more peace and therefore allowing for more cooperation in the region. I will now turn on to an expert that maybe will bring into the discussion also the military side of things. Whenever you discuss peace, you have to discuss military affairs as well. But sir, maybe a broader question first, looking at this interplay between economics and security. In your area of expertise, can these two be separated?
Well, not really. Not really. I mean, this is quite obvious, of course. And let me say this first of all, I'm afraid I cannot disagree with anything that has been said so far, which makes the discussion from my point of view a little bit boring, but I absolutely agree with all of you. And of course, I think it's quite obvious that those issues cannot be separated. I would even go further than that also morality cannot really be separated from all those affairs, from all those issues when it comes together at the end of the day. I would like to pick up the issue that you just raised about Iran, because as we're sitting here, as we're discussing these various issues and current affairs in the Mena region, there are protests going on in Iran. Actually, they have been going on for 2 months or so, and I've been following Iran for something like 20 years or so. And what I find interesting personally is that now I talk to various sources in Iran who are there on the ground, in Tehran basically, but also in other regions of Iran. And of course, I'm also talking to experts who have been dealing with Iran for years, if not for decades. And there seems to be a general feeling, and I think nobody can really put the finger on it, but there seems to be a general feeling that this time is different. We've had protests in 2019. I think we all remember them. Remember those protests that went on for weeks after subsidies were reduced and gasoline was suddenly, in the matter of a couple of days, substantially more expensive. We had similar protests going on in 2009, and a lot of experts who I talked to say it's different this time. When we're talking about how is the regime behaving, they seem to be, to a certain extent, clueless. For instance, it was very interesting to see that President Ebrahim Raisi, who is really a hardliner in the truest sense of the word, has not activated the revolutionary guards to quell the protests. There are some background reasons for that, because he's actually been working for a foundation that is, I would say, an economic competitor to the IRGC and things like that. But still, interestingly, he deployed the regular army, the Artesh, and the regular police, and not so much the revolutionary guards, which is something new in Iranian history, at least in the last 20 years or so. The next thing is that there are no obvious leaders, there are no obvious organizers of these protests. So it seems that the protests are really very much based on swarm intelligence. They are very much working via Instagram. Facebook is not available in Iran, but Instagram and Telegram, they are the main sources of, so to say, I would say, infrastructure to organize these protests as far as it is possible. The next thing is that what I've been told from sources on the ground is that one thing that really angered protesters is actually the high death toll, particularly among children and among teenagers. Because what have the law enforcement, police forces done so far? They have used rubber bullets. Rubber bullets are actually used in order to keep so to say, the number of lethally wounded persons low. They are, of course, much more effective, if I may say so, although it may sound cynical, when they're used against teenagers, against children, and then they can be very lethal. And this is, of course, something that has really triggered public anger among, I would say, very large parts of Iranian society. And all those factors are coming together, and now they're also exacerbated by the fact that those protests are not so much only in Tehran, but also they have a sectarian angle and they have a regional and ethnic angle. So we see that the protests are particularly strong in the Kurdish regions in the northwestern part of the country, and at the same time in the Sistan wa Baluchistan province in the southeast of the country. Interestingly, the Sunni clerics of those regions, they have been cooperating very closely for years and not sometimes even decades. So we're seeing now that there is a strong movement that is actually carried, that is supported by the younger parts of the Iranian society, by Kurdish minorities, by other minorities like Arabs, Azeris, etc., and also by the Sunnis. And the Sunnis make up something like a third of the Iranian population. So there seems to be a chance, to sum this up, there seems to be a chance that the regime is now really getting close to the brink of, I wouldn't say regime change, because it's also always speculation at that time of the day, at that point of this whole protest movement, to talk about regime change. But there are also some, I would say, very well experienced Iran experts who say that they have the impression that not only the people are tired of the regime, but there are indicators that the regime is tired of itself to a certain extent. And maybe there is potential for change within the regime. So, of course, this is for the time being all speculation, but we may see, I wouldn't say a U-turn in Iranian politics, but maybe really some sort of regime change, or at least evolution, the evolution of this regime, of this political system that has been so, well, intransigent for the last couple of decades. Now, one thing I would warn against is to expect, even if there is regime change, that we might see a U-turn in strategic directions that Iran has been following for a couple of years, for a couple of decades now. It will not simply withdraw from its membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The Americans and the Israelis will not be the best new friends forever, even if there is regime change at Tehran. But I think we should be very aware now that things are moving. Things are really moving, and moving in a very profound way in Iran. I think we all hope that it's going in a direction that the Abraham Accords have been when it comes to connections between Israel on the one hand, Arab states on the other hand. So let's wait and see. But I think now it's really a very good point in time and a very good opportunity for the European Union to simply take action. This is actually where I hand back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, talking is not enough. We also have to deliver. Thank you for highlighting the importance of having more situational awareness from the ground. This is then you're talking about the importance of also getting access to information, but also sharing information between different players that are there. You're talking about the role of social media in political change at the end of the day. And I see that indeed the discussion on Iran and its role in the MENA region is very fundamental for this discussion. If I can turn it back to you quickly, given that we've discussed Iran, how do you see developments in Saudi Arabia? I mean, there's been a lot of sort of expectation management at the level of the EU, but at the same time, when you're discussing this game of dependencies, this is an important factor that we need to keep in mind. So how do you see developments in this area?
Well, Saudi Arabia is to a certain extent always a little bit enigmatic. You can never know what's really going on there. But what we see right now, when we really take the actions and take it for what it is, actually we see growing distance between Saudi Arabia and the United States. We see a rapprochement, I would say the beginnings of a very careful rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, we're seeing I would say, closing in between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and China and the Russian Federation on the other hand. So it seems that, I would say, sands are shifting in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia is certainly one of the key players that we need to watch very closely. And I think it's too early to tell in which direction everything is moving. But I think it's also sort of connected with the Ukrainian crisis, because what we have seen so far from beginning of this year is that in particular, US interest had shifted away to a remarkable degree from the Middle East and really shifted towards Russia, towards Ukraine, towards Europe, and of course at the same time towards China and Taiwan. And it seems that the Middle East is now floating freely to a certain extent. And of course, I think it's quite obvious that also the Saudis, and not only the Saudis, but other countries in the region as well, are also thinking about those issues from another angle. And the question is here, which part of the world is on the rise and which part of the world is on the decline. And I think there seems to be a general consensus in various countries around the world, not only Saudi Arabia, but also India, Pakistan, Brazil, etc., that it's the East that is on the rise and maybe the West that is on the decline.
If I may add just something on this point, sorry. I think you're right, but ultimately Saudi Arabia wants to be in the Western camp. And so the movements that we are seeing is partly a result of certainly the perception, and maybe to a large degree also unfortunately the reality, that the US is withdrawing from the region. And Saudi Arabia is now exposed to the dramatic threat that Iran poses. We are now, I mean, Russia is acquiring weapons from Iran. And so I think we had a sort of idea that Iran, maybe this Middle Eastern, underdeveloped, under-sanctioned country, it's extremely sophisticated regime, extremely educated population. So what they have been producing is extremely, extremely powerful. And they have produced very, very effective drones and missiles against which Saudi Arabia is, in principle, powerless. And particularly as the United States is withdrawing. So if it's trying to maybe open certain doors to Iran, it's certainly not out of sympathy, but seeing, how this potential conflict could be managed. And of course, looking to Russia and China as counterbalancing powers. And I think here is again, I think the Western and also European approach needed. That we, of course, would like to see Saudi Arabia firmly in our camp and trying to not moving closer to Russia and China. And one element on an Iranian regime change, I think if it's a real regime change, not like sort of from the mullahs to the IRGC, if the regime is really gone, I think we will see a completely different Middle East.
Absolutely.
And the relationship, I mean, first of all it underwrites every single conflict in the region. And I think once this regime is gone, it will be a completely different world and opportunities will arise that we cannot even imagine. So here really we need a little bit of imagination and say, I know regime change is a bad word, and I don't mean it in the sense of sending Western troops into Iran, but we should now do everything we can to weaken this regime, support the protesters, because the benefits, not just in terms of human rights, but in terms of our very own, very selfish interests, are enormous.
Right. Just one sentence. I do agree, absolutely. And probably the best way is to politically support opposition, and it would be based on our principle, and that's what we are doing from European perspective. But we can do more. We can be more active in this case.
We can do more. We need to provide them with technology so that they can stay online. Perhaps an idea is the next step that we hopefully will see in Iran are strikes. We could think about building strike funds like we did during the Soviet time for Solidarność, providing these people, if they decide to strike, with funds to do. And of course, we need really crippling sanctions. I'm very happy about the sanctions that have been gone so far, but they are still not yet the kind of sanctions that will really weaken this regime. And we must do everything that we can to weaken the regime.
And I miss very much that no one of you said that the women in Iran started this revolution, because it is linked to the subject of mine, to the political Islam. And this instrumentalization of religion in Iran is the main problem of the society. And for me, it was not surprising that this revolution started with a women subject, with the headscarf. And they are burning it since weeks and sending a message to the world that they don't want this regime that is so oppressive and that is letting the people no freedom to talk, to walk, to wear clothes, to live. And I agree completely with you that we should do all we can to sanction this regime and to support the liberal forces that are acting now in a very, very dangerous context. You know, dozens of people have been shot and hundreds are, verletzt? Injured, yes, and dramatically injured also. And I think it's not only our interests as Europe, but it is also in the interest of the population of these, very well-educated, I would say, elite in Iran. That is the one who is now in the streets and fighting for our values, fighting for democracy. They are fighting for freedom, and they are fighting for freedom for expression, and all these are our values. And I don't understand why the EU countries are not having a position that is so clear in front of Iraq, like they did with Ukraine. And I think we should be self-critic and say sometimes we act. We act quickly if someone is just our neighbor culturally, and when it's not our neighbor culturally and it's far away, we hesitate and we are very, very skeptic if we can do anything. And just one more point, very, very important for me, is that Iran is exporting a very militant political Islam. You mentioned Hezbollah as proxy of Iran in Lebanon, but we have also Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and they are funding Hamas, which is a terroristic organization. They're funding it, and it's making impossible any political deal between Palestinians and Israeli, because we have this problem there. And we have also the Muslim Brotherhood, who is very, very active and present in the whole world, especially in Europe, where they get asylum since 40 or 50 years. And they are, by the way, also active here in the parliament. I just saw some days ago that the Turkish Muslim Brotherhood financed by Qatar, by the way, they have been here in the EU Parliament, Milli Görüş, it's their name, and the chief of Milli Görüş was here in the Parliament talking for the Uyghurs, for the Uyghur tragedy. That means that they try in Europe through their organizations and through their lobby organizations, which exist here in Brussels, to enter European institutions and to do as if they were representative for the Muslim population of Europe. And this problem, I think our politicians are not conscious about it because they think they are representing the Muslim population, but they are not. They are just representing themselves, and they have a totally other agenda than the Muslim population that is very well integrated in Europe.
Right. So thank you very much for the proactive dialogue here, making my life much easier. Let me just quickly sum it up and then give a bit of direction again. Where we're talking about the strategic creativity that is needed on the side of the European Union to really make more of an impact on the ground. Of course, SM Europe would not like to be seen as sort of coming up with strategies to influence regime change in Iran, but definitely all this discussion on geopolitics and geopolitical competition takes us to a kind of thinking that maybe we are in a sort of a Cold War 2.0. We see this on the technological side. We definitely see this at the level of values. So it's very important that we're discussing values here. I'm wondering, because you've been talking about the building of channels of influence, right? The politicization of religion. And in this global competition, the European Union is trying to influence in one way, but we see China also influencing different areas differently. I mean, if you look at Africa, for instance, through foreign investment and such. A question to you all, how do you see then the role of the other side in maybe beefing up the government in Iran and maybe promoting a different set of values from ours in some of these fringe areas? What is your evaluation of this? Maybe I'll start with you first.
What the other side is doing, you mean?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, I think that there are a lot of contradictions in this context because the European Union has tolerated a lot of years, has tolerated authoritarian regimes, until they couldn't hold them any longer. And then we had, for instance, this Arabic Spring, after 40 years of Gaddafi, after 35 years of Saddam Hussein, and so on, finally there was a reaction, and it has been said it's not a democratic state, we have to intervene, and so on. So the problem is that the international politics of the EU in the other side of the world is not very credible, you see? It's not very credible. So people are very hesitating, and they don't have the real confidence that the EU really means very seriously that they have to implement values like human rights. So if you come with human rights, most of the people will be very skeptical because what they see on the ground is the opposite. They see wars. They see interventions that are not democratically legitimated. And they see also that the measures, according to the country, are very different. They say, so now, for instance, we have people from Ukraine were very welcomed in Europe, yes, the refugees. But why are refugees from other people not welcome? So people are asking these questions. I think we need a lot of communication between both sides. And I believe that we need more trade relations. We need to make more trade relations to get in contact with the people and to give them also opportunity to be a partner, a trade partner. And I am really sure that through trade we can also talk about human rights, and we can also demand human rights if we make a trade that is ethically on the level. Yeah.
Right. Yes, thank you very much indeed. When you look at European trade policy, you have the by now famous trade and sustainable development chapters, which look precisely at this area of helping with positive change on the ground when you're talking about human rights, when you talk about labor rights, when you talk about climate protection. So indeed, the European Union, through its trade policy, is looking to be more proactive on this front. Very quickly, because you mentioned the Arab Spring, and maybe this is a controversial statement, but I'm curious about your opinion. Can we consider the Arab Spring a success? I mean, you've had in some areas, changes of governments, and particularly in one case, you end up with a government that is arguably more severe than the one that it has replaced.
Yes.
What is your take on this?
I think that the Arab Spring was an Arab winter, and I think it was a catastrophe for the region. Maybe one exception, that was Tunisia, that got the Nobel Prize for its work and dialogue, national dialogue, and to find a democratic way to change things. But otherwise, I think it was really a sad experience to see how the Muslim Brotherhood came up through this spring. Don't forget Morsi in Egypt, yes. The Muslim Brotherhood took this chance and put its people there. We had the war in Libya, we had war in Syria, we had a lot of, very, very sad events through this spring. And I don't know what to say about it, but a lot of people in the Arab region think that this spring was, in a certain way, was manipulated also. A lot of people say we saw things that we never saw before in the society. For instance, in Tunisia, people were holding papers written in English, and English is not the language of the country, as you know. So people were expecting even Arabic or French. So they are talking and saying, who had this idea of Arab Spring? A lot of people feel as if they were manipulated politically. But for me personally, it was not a good experience, because we saw how much the Muslim Brotherhood, that means the strongest Islamist movement of the world, existing since 100 years, came up and felt very strong. And I take the example of Tunisia. The last 11 years, we had a Nahda, Islamist movement at power. And since then, the society has totally changed. And for instance, human rights or women's rights were very, very in danger. And we have there a civic society that is very dynamic. And that's why the women's right could be protected from them. But the country is in a big crisis since 11 years. And that's, people have understood, it has to do with this Islamistic program that came with this party to the country. For the first time, they were at power there, and they destroyed a lot.
Right, so we generally see that regime change does not always mean the change for the better. Maybe a question to our two gentlemen here. How do you see our efforts to promote a more longer-term strategy in getting this value-based alignment, in basically ensuring that our policies will have a positive impact on the ground, particularly looking at economics and trade? How can we think more long-term? Please, Mr. Schwammenthal.
Well, I think I've always been very skeptical, this idea of Wandel durch Handel. In German, they say change through trade. I think it was always, to a large extent, sort of an attempt to cover up basically bare economic interests with a veneer of respectability. I do think, as you said, I do think it can work, and it can be an element but there has to be at least a certain level of readiness on the other side to change. But the idea that we could change Putin's Russia through trade or the mullah regime in Tehran was always absurd. But coming back to the Abraham Accords, if you look at the countries such as Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, I think you see societies that are willing to change. I mean, the mere willingness of making peace with Israel. You have no kosher restaurants in Dubai. Huge Jewish weddings are taking place. That is a fundamental demonstration of their willingness to really break with the taboo in the Arab world. And a sign of coexistence. Israel was not just the Jewish state, it was also the Western state, the Western colonial European outpost in the Middle East. That was sort of for a long time the Arab propaganda. To break with that is for me the clearest demonstration that these societies want to change. Unfortunately, I don't think that these are necessarily the countries that are on the top of Europe's agenda when it goes to the thinking about the Middle East. I think here are huge potentials, and again, I would say for mutual benefit. If you need to have a sign on the other side, yes, there is new thinking. These are countries that want to modernize their economies and societies, and I think here we have an opportunity as Europeans to come in to help, but also, for our own benefit, because again, I mean, United Arab Emirates has a huge sovereign wealth fund. They are interested in investments, in cooperation. They are huge cooperation already in just 2 years between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Morocco, yeah. And Morocco as well. It's unbelievable what happened in the last 2 years. And which were still marked by COVID. I mean, people are thinking about economic activity between Israel and United Emirates over the next 10 years reaching $1 trillion. I don't know if those numbers are realistic, but it shows the energy that is there. And again, as I said earlier, I think Europe should come behind it for its own benefit and to promote real coexistence in the region.
Right. So we definitely can't help someone if they don't want to help themselves. It's difficult to change the situation on the ground in third countries. Should we even change the situation on the ground in third countries? But the question right now is, what can we do at home? How can we boost our own resilience and preparedness maybe to withstand some of these greater shocks that come from political circumstances abroad? Mr. Stefan, you can come in on this, or if you have a different point, please.
I think it is very much connected. It's a very good point. What can we do? We have to be more united. We have to have finally foreign policy in place. We are not still united in terms of foreign policy. I do agree absolutely with your point that there is a lot of skepticism by changing only through trade. The last example is Nord Stream 2 and how Germany tried to be close to Russia. What was the result? At the beginning of this year, it brought us to the energy crisis at the end. At the beginning of this year, 40% of gas was coming from Russia. Now, fortunately, only 6%, so we are changing. But for many years, we have built this dependence, unfortunately, and we were not principled. And it was the result that we were not insisting on the sides of value, of keeping values in our trade. And the answer to your question is what to do. We have to be united in foreign policy. We have to understand that we are the union of member states, but each member state has their own trade, on foreign policy and on defense policy still, not trade. And so there is some discrepancy. So there is the challenge to cooperate much more, to cooperate from a foreign and security perspective. I think for future Commission, I can imagine that we will not only reinforce our foreign policy aspect, but also defense aspect. I think we need a Commissioner for Defense as well, which will be in line with our foreign policy. We have to be united. And if I may, just one point, I'd like to refer to your point about being like Muslim brothers in European Parliament. You are right, but we have to understand that we have many groups in the European Parliament. It does not mean that they are recognized by European Parliament, because as you have many groups in Muslim world, also in European Parliament, you have also extremists, even from left to right. So if there was some political group organizing some discussion, it is not right, and we have protested against that from our point of view. But it does not mean that they are recognized by European Parliament. It is just a remark that probably they can communicate it, but this is not a matter of fact.
Yes, I know that. I know that, but it's also important that all politicians know about it and that they know who they are. Because as you said, we have values. If you really want to implement values, we have also to think about these ideologies that are working here, these ideologies that, to take the Abraham Accords as example, it is an ideology that makes people be very skeptical to any relation to Israel, you understand? And this ideology comes from the Islamists, you know? They don't want people to get and to have a normal relationship to Jews because their ideology is fundamentally anti-Semitic, you understand? And that's why it is the same thing. You have to combat the ideology, to learn to accept the other. You have to prepare this terrain before you can have normal relations to the other, you understand? And the Islamists are spreading an ideology here in Europe, in their organizations, the ideology that is really anti-Semitic and homophobic and misogyn, yes, you understand? And it is this ideology that is, that hinders any normal relation to the other. And that's why it's the same thing, you know, we are talking about. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for the response there. Mr. Pisecki, if I can turn to you. I guess that you're also advising companies and businesses on how to navigate these complex waters. And now, again, turning back to business and economics for a little bit, how can you really advise companies, or what can companies do in order to boost their own capacity to deal with some of these political, geopolitical shocks? And how can they find the right balance between values and competitiveness and economic growth?
First of all, there is this, I would say, whole issue of risk management, which has really taken a considerable uptick since 2009, when there was this big financial crisis, and actually all companies more or less were, I would say, supposed or even obliged to really take care of risk management and take risk management seriously, which had not always been the case before that. So I would say that geopolitical risks are certainly more important right now than they have been something like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years or so ago. But basically, with all the risk management, the norms, the compliance standards, etc., there is a legal framework that actually companies can work with. When it comes to, I would say, concrete behavior, what can companies do? I tell my clients, don't be cynical and don't be naive. And if you find the right balance between those two extremes, then you're actually on the right track. Let me just add one more thing, because you have already raised the issues of, is there a change through trade and how does this actually work out in practice? I think one aspect that should not be underestimated here, when we're really talking about very concrete issues and very concrete examples, is what is actually the kind of trade that we're talking about. It's a big difference of talking, for instance, to state-owned oil companies, state-owned gas companies, large construction companies that are usually very much controlled by the state, regardless of whether we're talking about Turkey, about Iran, about China, etc., etc. And I think it's also very important simply to be aware of who are you actually talking to. If I want to change Russia or China through trading with the oil energy companies, it simply won't work. This is a different angle too, and this is the question: to what extent can national governments use, for instance, their strategic assets in a geopolitical, in a strategic sense? Let me take a positive example, for instance. There was something like a couple of months ago, this crunch when it came to computer chips. when actually there was high demand, there was low supply, and one of the main suppliers, as we all know, is Taiwan. And Taiwan, the Taiwanese government said very clearly, okay, we can of course steer who are the companies that we are providing with the chips that we produce, and who is maybe only tier 2, tier 3, and not so much the priority customer that we actually working for. And they said very clearly, we are the number one trading partners that we have, the most important countries that we supply with our sophisticated computer chips are those countries that we are actually working here also in security issues together with. For instance, the United States, but also certain European countries that are having a naval presence in the Pacific Ocean. So here's a typical example where you have a national government that has a comprehensive approach, combining trade issues on the one hand and security issues on the other hand. I think this might serve as a very good example of how things can be done in the future.
Right. Thank you very much. Indeed, we also see risk management is fundamental in this case. And again, thinking long term. And we had some complaints about, for instance, European companies in China going in and saying, oh, we can make a quick buck on the short term, but on the longer term, as we can see nowadays, the situation is a lot more complex. Also, looking at black swans, gray rhinos, unexpected events, beefing up your capability to withstand these shocks is fundamental for businesses. And then it's a game of balances, right? So don't be cynical, don't be naive. Look at values, but try to maintain competitiveness. Mr. Stefanets, maybe as a way to also gear towards the conclusions of our discussion here today, how do you see the role once again of the European Union, also on the regulatory side of things, to merge and to find the right way forward, a sensible way forward for both companies but also institutions to build towards a more resilient future? Please.
Thank you. The way forward, as I mentioned, the unification of foreign policy and also in terms of trade policy, the inclusion of human rights aspects into trade policies and into the trade agreements, because I'm quite skeptical if we go ahead with some kind of legislation that it can create additional bureaucracy and it can create additional, let's say, impact on competitiveness of our industries, which we don't need. So therefore, I very much favor the way via trade agreements in the question of how to go ahead. But stressing out this aspect, I think the most important remark is, and I do believe that everybody contributed significantly to this, is that there is no trade policy without values, that we cannot only look at economical interest, because if we do so, the payback is very negative. There is always very, very negative learning from history, even from present development. So therefore, we have to pay attention with whom we do our trade, and at the same time, we have to pay attention about human rights aspect in respective countries.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately, as all good discussions, sometimes we have to come to an end. As we could see, the situation is very complex. I think we only touched on maybe 0.5% of everything that we could have discussed in the MENA region and beyond. We see that the road ahead for the European Union is a very, very challenging one. We need to be more united, indeed. We have to look at what the treaties allow us to do. We have to consider different competences that we have, and build in more morality in our policy making. The challenges are multifaceted, so should the solutions be. And this kind of dialogue that we have here today with the political side of things, with human rights, with research and analysis capabilities is something that provides us this holistic picture that will allow us to build sensible policies looking forward. So here at SM Europe, we're very happy that you're with us, and we look forward to continuing this discussion, because indeed this has only been the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.